Darling, 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 bark, darling. All right, boys, to the crack den away. Darling, 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 we are the Frankfurters, and it's a hot dog joke. Darling, 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 what? I think we got a Spanish-speaking pony. That's not very good. Darling, darling. Hey, where are you going? We need to find crystal meth. Darling, 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 darling. Oh, come on. Speak plain old English. We don't know how to speak anything else. Darling, 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 darling. I can't understand a word you're saying. Speak English. Darling, 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 darling. Darling, 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 darling. Okay, we get it. You understand us, but we can't understand you. Darling, 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 darling. Darling. Enough, we get it. Okay, fine. Darling, 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 darling. Stop. We just want to cook meth. Darling? Yes, we just want to cook crystal meth. That's why we're here, to see you cook meth. Darling? What do you guys think? How do we make her cook meth? Get back to the kitchen. Darling? Darling, 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 darling. Darling, 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 darling. We got you your crystals. Darling, now make darling. With the meth. That's why it's called crystal meth. Darling? Darling, 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 darling. I feel darling, 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 darling. Darling, 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 darling. Darling, 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 darling. Why did you make her cry like that? Darling, darling, darling. We're gonna get HR to help you out with that. Darling, 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 darling. What in the world did you just do? It's all good. Darling, darling, darling. Come on, it was just a nice little slap. Yeah, they did it back in football. Darling, 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 darling. Darling, darling, someone darling, save darling, us from darling, this pain. Darling, put us out of our misery. We're here, horse friend beam. Darling, 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 darling. Darling, darling, darling. Darling, darling, darling. Darling, darling. Darling, darling. Darling, 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 darling.